Well, good morning, everybody. And thank you, Sheila, again for the invitation to come down. Actually, this is a nice break because it is our craziest time of year right now. Let me see a show of hands again. I know Sheila just asked, but how many have been up to the Shipwreck Museum before? Okay, for those of you who haven't, I'll talk a little bit about who we are, what we do, some things that probably most of you are very aware of if you visited, but some things maybe that you're not aware of that we do that are probably more core to our mission. But I'm going to go ahead and talk about this shipwreck here today. It is called the Western Reserve. Is anybody familiar with this story? No, I wouldn't think so. I've done this program a couple times, and every time I ask that question, I think other than the super boat nerds that might be out there that are shipwreck people or researchers or that kind of thing, they might be aware because this was a really, really big story back in the 1890s. You know, there's one shipwreck today that everybody talks about. What is that? Exactly. Yeah, you'll see a few slides related to that. You know, a lot of times people like to make connections with the Fitzgerald and other shipwrecks and things like that. This one, actually, you can make a few comparisons because of the importance of the ship itself. And this was a very, very big story in the summer and fall of 1892 and the years after that, because it was just a very big deal. But we'll go ahead and move on here. And that would help. Let's give it a second here. Got the laser pointer. There we go. I'm not really much of a technology guy. If I had a rotary dial phone, I would be perfectly happy. Yes, ma'am. Is the Western Reserve that was named the ship, does that have anything to do with Western Reserve University? Well, it does with, yes, the university, which was named after a big, huge section of land down in northeastern Ohio. That's what it was named after. Yeah, so I'll get into that a little bit as we go here too. Oh, you're welcome. So the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum, we're located at the site of the oldest operating lighthouse on Lake Superior, Whitefish Point Lighthouse. This is pretty much what it looks like these days. That tower was built in 1861. Sometimes people are surprised at that. They think it's a newer tower because of its design, but think about 1861 for a second. You know, a lot of times I'll be doing programs for fourth grade groups and things like that, so I like to quiz them. Who was president of the United States in 1861? Who can answer that? Abraham Lincoln, that's right. You get a smiley face right there, or a star. I don't know if they do that stuff anymore, but yeah, the Civil War was just starting, and that tower was being built at Whitefish Point, and that's actually the newer tower. We had one in the 1840s as well that really didn't last very long. Lighthouse keepers were worried that when big storms came up, the tower was going to fall over. Not a very comforting thought if you're a lighthouse keeper up there inside the tower itself. This is what it looks like now. For a good chunk of the year, that's what it looks like. That's what it looked like practically in late April at this point. I'm only slightly exaggerating. We had a pretty rough winter, which I know you did as well. How many live here in Petoskey? Are the rest of you you go somewhere where it's warm in the winter? Is that what happens? Or Ann Arbor? Well, a little bit warmer there. But yeah, we had a rough winter. And, you know, we are a historic site that features structures from the 1860s all the way up mostly through the 1920s as far as our, you know, the historic site goes itself. There used to be a motor lifeboat station up there as well. And just to give you an idea, again, for those of you who have not visited, we're located right over there. I'm kind of looking at this from an angle, but Whitefish Point is right there. This is the Upper Peninsula, obviously. We're right kind of down in here. And to get a close up here, there's Whitefish Point right there. This is all Lake Superior. And Grand Island and Munising. How many have ever been to Grand Island, by the way, too? Anybody not heard of Grand Island? I see a lot, you know, honestly, when I do programs, I see a lot of hands go up that people have never heard of it before. It is such a lovely area. And there's a lighthouse that's there. And it's not the one that you see if you've ever taken a Pictured Rocks cruise. You see this wooden tower and lighthouse as you take the Pictured Rocks cruise. It looks like that lighthouse hasn't had a paint job for like 100 years. That's not the one that we're taking care of at the Shipwreck Society. There's one on the north end that's on a cliff that's over 200 feet high. It's one of the highest, if not the highest above sea level in the country. And so we're getting over there quite a bit these days. But this whole area right here, and if we include Whitefish Bay over here, this whole area is littered with shipwrecks, and that's not an exaggeration. There's about 200 shipwrecks right in that area. And really the primary reasons for this, the weather, of course, we can't get around the weather and how dramatic it can be up there. The storms are typically blowing in out of the northwest, and they kind of pound this shoreline right here. If you look closely, you'll notice there's not really much in the way of harbors there for those ships to kind of get in if they, get caught out in a storm or that kind of thing. Grand Marais got a little bit of one right there, but for a ship in a really nasty storm to try to maneuver in there, that was a pretty tough proposition. A lot of them would try to drop anchor and wait to try to get in there when the weather calmed just a little bit. So weather had a lot to do with it. The ship traffic itself, if we see 3 or 4 or 5 ships passing a day these days, we're pretty excited about that. We're all boat nerds up there ourselves. So, but if we went back to the 1890s when the Western Reserve was sailing, you would see a parade of ship traffic passing. A couple thousand ships were operating the lakes at that point, and there was a huge amount of traffic passing. So collision was a problem back then. For those of you who visited the museum, we have 2 or 3 different exhibits that really reflect the danger of collision for these ships back in the day. If you put fog in there in the mix, snowstorms, anything with reduced visibility, these ships were passing in pretty close proximity, upbound and downbound. We even have one shipwreck where they were both ships of the same fleet, and one got a little closer to the other for a greeting. Somebody misunderstood a signal. The other one crossed in front of the one that was going downbound, and pretty soon they're crashing into each other. And you've got one going to the bottom and the other one limping back into Sault Ste. Marie, that kind of thing. So these kinds of things could happen. And the other thing that I always point out that we can never not recognize is the idea of human error in the middle of all these things. Think of where you have more traffic, no matter what the traffic, your chances of having an accident are increased. And that's exactly what we were talking about up here at Whitefish Point. There's so many shipwrecks in that area. And by the way, are any of you familiar with an author and a historian by the name of Fred Stonehouse? I'm surprised at that. Fred's probably got about 35 books out at this point, and he is one of the 2 individuals that ended up getting me interested in shipwrecks and maritime history in the Great Lakes. He was the first to write a book about the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, and that was literally the title of his book. It came out in 1977. I still have my first edition copy that is all wrinkled up, and there are coffee stains all over it, and it looks like it's been through the mill. But I bought it as a child. I told Fred that I was 11 years old when I bought your book. I'm not sure Fred was overly impressed by that. Fred's a pretty funny guy, and he took it in good humor, but it is a fact, and it's one of the 2 books that really captured my imagination, I guess you could say, about shipwrecks on the Great Lakes. The other one, if you ever get a chance to pick up a copy, an author with the last name of Ratigan, Ratigan, Great Lakes Shipwrecks and Survivals, William Ratigan. That's a fantastic book, and his writing style really kind of captures a little bit of something in the stories of these shipwrecks that are really right off of our shorelines, and most of the time people don't know anything about. So yeah, Fred wrote a book called Lake Superior Shipwreck Coast that's dedicated just to this area where the Shipwreck Museum is, and this area that in more recent years has gotten to be known as the Shipwreck Coast. That's more of a recent thing, but if you look back at historical newspapers, 1880s, 1890s, you will see references to the graveyard of the Great Lakes, and that reference being this area right here. Now, if some of you live in other areas of the Great Lakes, there's graveyards of the Great Lakes all over the place. That's not anything unique to Whitefish Point, but this is one of them, and this is probably one of the more dangerous areas. Not so much for shipping today, but our lighthouse is still active at this point. And at one point, I had an opportunity to talk to the captain of the largest ship sailing in the Great Lakes. Does anybody know which one that is at this point? Any boat nerds? The Paul Tregurtha is the largest operator. It's like 1,014 feet or something like that operating. It's just one of these 1,000 footers you see out there. And I asked him the question that we get at Whitefish Point a lot, because people will come through and then we'll tell them that we're still an active light station, and people are like, well, do these ships really need these things? They've got GPS, they've got radar, they've got all this technology. Why do they really need a lighthouse these days? That captain answered that question very succinctly for me, and what he said was technology can fail, for starters, and 2, there's something to be said about your own eyes and seeing that light after you've crossed Lake Superior, especially if it's in the fall when most of these ships are getting into trouble. You'll notice my title is Gales of August. We're talking about a different time of year here, but fall is the worst time of year, and that's what that captain was referring to. But honestly, the lakes, you all know this, you're right here on the shoreline, but it can be nasty any time of the year. And there will be a lot of times in midsummer where I'll be driving up to work and I'll look out in Whitefish Bay and I'll see 5 or 6 or 7 ships with anchors dropped, just waiting out there in the bay. And to me, it's like, wow, this is a calm, sunny day. What are they doing? But it tells you something is happening up on the big lake at that point. And that also is a reflection post 1975. They weren't as inclined to do that before November the 10th, 1975. After the Fitzgerald sank, I think this was a bit of a wake-up call. That's just my theory on this. And I didn't ask that captain. I should have asked him that at the time. But I do think they take it seriously, much more seriously now than they ever did before. So yeah, this area is just bad enough for shipwrecks that Fred wrote a book just about this area itself. We sell that up at the Shipwreck Museum. It has long since gone out of print, but he gave us the ability to have it republished, and then we're the last ones to carry this book at this point. So the Shipwreck Museum itself, this is the hub of where we talk about those shipwrecks. We have a dozen shipwrecks represented, one going as far back as 1816, a ship called the Invincible. There's probably a message in there or a lesson. You don't want to name your ship Invincible. That's 1816. The ship sailed right through the War of 1812 without a scratch, just to come to grief off of Whitefish Point, not even getting out into the lake. It went aground and sank somewhere just south of Whitefish Point. We've been looking for it. We haven't found it yet. And of course, the bell from the Edmund Fitzgerald is the centerpiece inside that. That bell was recovered in July of 1995, and then 1996, it was on exhibit. That was my first year working at the museum. I did an internship at that point, and you can see the bell right there. We have people coming from, I say, all around the world. That's not a big exaggeration. It's amazing the emotional attachment that people have, for one reason or another, to this story of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Some of us find that, and I say some of us, this is staff, this is me, but I'm also going to include some of the Fitzgerald surviving family members in here, that this kind of fascination that borders beyond just a fascination sometimes that people have for the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Why do we know about the Fitzgerald? Most of us? Exactly. Gordon Lightfoot, a Canadian folk singer. He didn't write songs about the Daniel J. Morrell that sank in 1966, or the Carl D. Bradley that sank not too far from here in 1958. A lot of other shipwrecks. I mean, some statistics tell us 6,000 shipwrecks on the lakes. Other statistics tell us 10,000 shipwrecks on the Great Lakes. There's a lot of other shipwrecks out there, and they all have their own story. And all of them also had crew members on board, and all those crew members were no different than those 29 men that went down with the Fitzgerald. This is something that each year that we do our memorial service at Whitefish Point, and that's the only time we ring that bell right there. We ring it 30 times, 29 times for each sailor on the Fitzgerald, but a 30th time for all sailors lost on the Great Lakes. And I think that's an important point, because there are all those other wrecks that are out there. So when Sheila was introducing me, she mentioned there were 2 sites, of course, Whitefish Point that we just talked about. This is a picture that was taken in the 1880s. That tower is probably, that was probably taken in right around maybe 1890. It's probably hard for you to see, but right there is a lady standing, and she has her dog. The tower is like a black color, very different than what you see today. We have that tower is white when you see it today, but when it was first built, they painted it like this dark, dark, dark brown, almost black color. And the idea there was it would make it a little bit more noticeable on the skyline, if you want to call it that. That was its day mark as these ships were passing at daytime. But Whitefish Point, that's a National Historic Site. That's the main site we operate. And then this is the one. How many have ever been here before? The Weather Bureau building, 1899. Did I see a hand go up? Yeah? You're rare, because not many people raise their hands when I ask that question, because people don't know where it is. I mean, it's right there on the grounds of the Sioux Locks, but people just miss it. And we've actually gotten to where we only have it open on weekends now, because the attendance, even though there's several 100,000 people that visit the locks each year, people are running like those ships are magnets. They want to go to the lookout towers, the watch platforms, they want to go into the visitor center. Somehow they miss the old Weather Bureau building. But we have exhibits in there. We're open on weekends. If you go up there to the Sioux, stop in and visit Ron. He's been working there forever, pretty much. I would joke if he was here and say he's been working here since the 1890s. He would laugh at that probably. But we are a 501c3. We're a relatively small nonprofit. Those two sites up top are what we operate, but we're also working on that Grand Island North Lighthouse that I just mentioned a few minutes ago. That's something recent. We have a staff of about 35. You can see some of them right there. We are starved for staff at the after the program. I think I'm going to be working a frontline position here pretty closely. We're losing college students at this point. But yeah, about 35 of us work there in the summer, and then we go down to 4 of us in the off season. We interpret the lighthouse service. We interpret the shipwrecks, obviously, the National Weather Service, the United States Life Saving Service. How many are familiar with the Life Saving Service? I see a couple hands going up. Yeah, not a lot of times, and we'll have big groups of people coming through there, and I'll ask the same question, and usually I'll get 1 or 2 hands going up. This is a predecessor to the Coast Guard. 1870s it formed, but the formation of such a thing as the Life Saving Service goes way back before that on the East Coast, where you would have had volunteer stations. Think of like a volunteer fire department. Well, the idea was if a ship got into trouble, it was the same thing where you had volunteer crewmen that would come in. That wasn't an ideal situation. But we get into the mid-1870s, and now you have stations. You've got the federal government taking responsibility for these things. So we interpret that history, but primarily just as it is along that shoreline that we call the shipwreck coast. And then at Whitefish Point, we never had a life-saving station, but what we did have was a motor lifeboat station. And it was really the same concept that you had crews in some of these remote areas, and maybe not so remote areas in some cases, but wherever ships got into trouble, in this case, the Coast Guard had stations that had big boats like this one right here, 36-footer motor lifeboat. It would go down rails. They could launch it out in the water. They could zoom off and try to rescue a crew that was in distress. There was a movie called The Finest Hours. Has anybody seen that? Chris Pine was in it. It was about, good, I see a couple of you nodding. Fantastic story and a true story. And actually part of our motor lifeboat was actually in it. The steering wheel was in it. So that was it. That's our claim to fame. But the Coast Guard called it the greatest small boat rescue in Coast Guard history. And this was on the East Coast, which is actually where that particular motor lifeboat is from. This one is only 10 hull numbers away from the original we had at Whitefish Point, but that boat was about to be burnt to the ground for all the hardware that was on it, the brass and copper and everything else. They wanted to get that off of that boat. Well, this is after we took it to Murtaugh Boat Works, and they worked on it for a few years down there in Hessel. And then a couple of Octobers ago, we were able to bring it back up. We had to put it on a crane and lift it up and lift it over the building, and then bring it down in front of the building and get it on this kind of cart, if you want to call it that, carriage that it would rest on. And then we had to winch it into the building itself. I had just talked to our insurance company the day before that. We didn't tell anybody we were doing this, because what we didn't want to have is have a big crowd and this thing somehow breaks loose and falls through the roof of the building after, years of work. But that's another type of history that we interpret also at Whitefish Point. We have a couple of new exhibits this year. This one is about the shipwreck of the Daniel J. Morrell. That actually opened a couple of years ago, but we did some additional work on it, just reopened it this year. How many are familiar with the Daniel J. Morrell? See, nobody's ever heard of that wreck. 1966, not really that long ago. 66, this shipwreck, Northern Lake Huron. The ship literally broke in two. Crew of 29, one man survived. One man by the name of Dennis Hale. And he only died a few years ago, but he would travel all over the world, actually telling the story of his ship, what happened. I mean, it's an amazing story. That ship, and there's a model, broke in half. The stern section actually went another 5 miles before it sank. They have no idea what happened to the crew that was left on the stern. And Dennis just tells this story, or when he was alive, he did. It was just a fantastic story. And then this other one, definitely, I'd say most people have never heard of. It's a shipwreck called the A.A. Parker. It sank in 1903 off of Grand Marais. It actually sank twice. It got hit in the Detroit River and sank early on in its career, late 1890s, and then they refloated a man by the name of Aaron A. Parker. He named it in honor of himself, A. Parker, and then it was traveling up into Lake Superior, and a storm overwhelmed the ship and it sank. But it's a great story, and this particular shipwreck you can just see the stern of it right there, is just a fascinating thing for divers. But we haven't really released the coordinates of this to too many people. But the ones, because we discovered it a number of years ago, the Shipwreck Society. But the people that do see it, they say this is amazing. It's like a time portal where you can see all these things from 1903 that are on the bottom of the lake. And it's like this interesting, I would say open air, but underwater museum unto itself. So that's a new exhibit we opened up this year, and it's got a great story that goes along with it. But as fascinating as all those shipwrecks are, this is the one that most people come up to visit the Shipwreck Museum to learn more about. The Edmund Fitzgerald, built in 1958, down in the Detroit area, Ecorse, Michigan, at the Great Lakes Engineering Works. And by 1975, and it was a pretty young ship at that point by Great Lakes standards, of course, it was overwhelmed by a storm 17 miles northwest of Whitefish Point. The ship sank so quickly that crew, and this was a pretty modern ship at that time, the crew didn't have a chance to get the distress signal out. Think about that. A 729-foot ship going to the bottom so quickly that there was not one moment to get a distress signal out. That tells you about the power of the Great Lakes and Lake Superior in particular. And that is the shipwreck that really draws in most people, but it allows us to speak to those other shipwrecks that are in the area, shipwrecks in general. Now, if this is something most people know about, what people don't know about when they visit the museum, and this is a big part of this story of the Western Reserve, it's kind of a sub-story, at least as far as the overall history, are marine operations, Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society. We actually have, and you can see the two primary crewmen, they're actually out on the water right now. That's our captain, that's a guy by the name of Daryl Ertel, that's his brother Dan, and they're a pretty good team. They don't really talk a whole lot on the boat. They've been around each other forever, apparently. They're brothers. And it's so weird when I'm out there with them and it's just the three of us, they don't talk to each other. There's no real communications. So it's kind of an interesting thing. And actually, I had their aunt in one of these programs that I did. Actually, I did one in Harbor Springs and made that same reference. She came up to me after the program and she introduced herself as their aunt. I thought, oh man, she's going to be mad at what I said. But she just started laughing and said, that's so true about those two. But what they lack in communications with each other, they make up for by knowing what they're doing. They are so good at what they do out there on Lake Superior looking for shipwrecks. And this goes to the core of the operations for the Shipwreck Society. The organization started in 1978. My predecessor, a guy by the name of Tom Farnquist, and a number of other people formed this organization, but really they were forming it around the idea of finding these shipwrecks and documenting them. There were some other things going on. It was prior to the state laws that protected these shipwrecks, so people were bringing up artifacts and things. You'd have a lovely ship's wheel that might be disintegrating in somebody's garage in Florida somewhere, or Wisconsin, or wherever. So a lot of these things were being pilfered. Then by the early 1980s, that legislation came through that protected these shipwrecks, and now you have to have a permit from the state of Michigan Underwater Salvage and Preserve Committee to bring things up. It's a pretty lengthy process. We've gone through it ourselves. There was one, there's an 1876 shipwreck out in the middle of Whitefish Bay called the Comet. People call it a treasure ship, but it's not. It's not like their chests full of gold bullion or anything like that you see in the movies. What it is it has silver ore. It was hauling silver ore, but that's gotten confused across the decades. And there was a threat that we were understanding. I use the term threat, but some friends, it's a kind of a small community, the scuba diving community, and some people have understood that there were some divers out there that wanted to go just get that safe. There's a safe sitting near the wreck site that was from the ship itself. So we petitioned the Underwater Salvage and Preserve Committee. That's a governor-appointed committee, and they did give us permission to go retrieve it. And we were going to work with the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary to do this. But the other problem was I'm not a conservation person. I'm not a conservator. We don't have a conservator on staff. And so in order to do this, we also had to have that conservation plan in place. We did get a quote from a company out of Wisconsin, very nice people. But this artifact, a safe, it was a composite artifact. So you had wood, you had steel, you had all kinds of things. It was going to be nearly $100,000 for us to conserve that artifact. And we're like, okay, game over for us. We can't afford that. So, and we didn't find any patron to come forward and underwrite this project. So to the best of our knowledge, that safe is still down there at this point, but the technology is so good these days that somebody could recover that probably relatively easily. But my whole point was showing the flag again in the marine operations aspect. That's what we did, and that's what we do. It was a big part of the organization starting up. We have a 50-foot long research vessel, not the prettiest vessel in the world, certainly not the fastest. It's a former U.S. Army Corps of Engineers research vessel called the David Boyd. There was an officer in the Army Corps of Engineers by the name of David Boyd. That's where that name comes from. But we have a sonar system on the back of it. You can see right there, it looks like a little torpedo on the back. And we will tow that. And that is Dan. He's our first mate. Sarah Wildy. She's our operations manager. And when I'm lucky, I can actually get out there myself. But this is our busiest time of the year, so it is hard to do that. There's our ROV right there. I'll talk about that in a minute. But you can get another view right there. That's what the tow fish, as we call it, a tow fish. What that is our sonar system right there. And there's a company called Marine Sonic Technology. It's out of Yorktown, Virginia. We worked out an arrangement with them where they charged us about a third of what the cost of this sonar system, and it's not inexpensive, that if we found anything, we would make sure that we included their name in our press releases. And you notice right now, I just did the program, or I'm doing this program, and I said Marine Sonic Technology. So if any of you want to go out and buy a sonar system, there you go, Marine Sonic Technology. They're the people you need to talk to. But it is a great system that they sold us, because since we bought it, we found 15 shipwrecks. So we've had some really, really good luck. And that's what the tow fish looks like right there. And we will tow that with this big armored cable, and we can put out over 1,000 feet of cable and have that thing behind us. And we can see about a half mile out on each side of that tow fish. And so what we do is sort of paint, so to speak. Those sound waves go back, they reflect off of objects that might be on the bottom of the lake, on the lake floor. And if there is something down there, it's almost like taking a flashlight. Daryl, our captain, has this great, he'll take a ship model and put a flashlight on it. And you know, if you put a flashlight, you get a little shadow behind it. That's kind of what we're doing. Those sound waves are a light, so to speak, but it's really more sound going on to that. And we'll see a shadow on our screens, our computer screens inside the Boyd itself. And I'll show you one here in a little while. But we can be out there 10 hours a day, 11, 12 hours a day. They're long days. We have sometimes trouble getting volunteers to join us because it can be pretty boring out there. And Daryl and Dan don't really talk. So it's, you know, I love it because to me, it's really fun to be out on the lake. I'd rather be doing that than reviewing financials for the museum and things like that in my office, or hearing again how we don't have any staff and blah, blah, blah. This to me is an escape, but I'm lucky. I've only been out there once this year. Usually it's about 5 or 6 times that I get out there. But we can tow, and we leave places like Grand Marais, usually about 5 in the morning. This is coming out of Grand Marais right there. This is a guy by the name of Rick Mixter. This was a wreck that we found in 2023. How many of you, are you aware of Rick? Rick Mixter? Yeah, Rick does programs all over the place. Rick's a great guy. He's one of our board members, so he's one of my bosses. So of course I'm going to say he's a great guy, but no, he is a great guy. He does wonderful programs as well. But Rick joined us, and there's a couple of shipwrecks that we found that we were going to document, and he was particularly interested in these. He's actually done programs on them, and I'll talk about them here in a minute as well. But sometimes we find a wreck out in the middle of the lake. It's going to take us 4 hours just to get out there. And what we'll do once we get out there is we'll put our ROV, and this is actually a crew from National Geographic that came out to do, actually, believe it or not, a program on us, the Shipwreck Society. We're this little nonprofit, but here we found all these shipwrecks. So they wanted to do a program. They actually were just here 2 weeks ago as well. So they're doing a second edition of this program that they did. How many saw that on National Geographic? No hands going up. You know, when they did this program, and we asked the producer, she's the nicest lady. This is her right here, Erin. We asked her, when you guys put this thing out, you put it out on a Friday morning on the Nat Geo channel, Friday morning at like 6 a.m. Who's up watching Nat Geo at 6 a.m. on a Friday morning? It's now on YouTube. So if you were to go onto YouTube and if you put in Ghost Ships, Great Lakes, Nat Geo, it's going to come up. And you're going to see the program right there. They just did another one. And when we put that ROV down, and this thing is pretty old, it's older than most of our staff, it's over 30 years old. But when we put it down, we can get images like this. First one I'm going to show you, this is a shipwreck called the Atlanta, went down in May of 1891. It was a schooner barge, practically brand new. And this one is unusual because the ROV is getting closer. You can just on the right side of the screen see, you can see the name board. This is unusual. This is unusual. We don't often have them beating us over the head and telling us exactly what shipwreck that we're looking at. But that one, and Rick was on board as well when we found it and when we had the ROV on it. He said he had never seen anything like this before. This shipwreck, you can still see the gold leaf around the letters. You can see the scroll work that's on either side. You can just see parts of it right there. It's just astounding to me that that ship went down in 1891. We can still see the paint. We can still see, again, the name Atlanta on this very, very elaborate name board that's on the side of it. And the story that goes along with this too, this crew did not want to leave their ship. They worked the pumps, hand pumps, trying to pump the water out that was coming in for about, well, overnight, and their ship finally sank in the morning. Selden E. Marvin, this is the one that Rick was really, really interested in. This one also was pretty obvious what we were looking at. But the Selden E. Marvin went down with two other ships in the same storm. They were all connected to each other. There was a steamship called the C.F. Curtis. It was pulling the Selden E. Marvin, and another ship called the Annie M. Peterson. That was pretty common back in the day to have a steamship pulling two schooner barges, and they had ropes attached. So they had the steamship, a big heavy hawser rope attached to the Selden E. Marvin. And then on the back of the Marvin, there was another hawser connected to a big tow bit, and that went on to the Annie M. Peterson. They all went down May 19th, 1914 in the same storm. And there you can see Selden E. Marvin on the side, named after a Civil War officer. But this is another one that there was no question what we were looking at. Yes. You know, they can be anywhere. These, I believe, are right around 300 feet, if I remember correctly. The C.F. Curtis is the steamship that was towing the other two. It was towing the Selden E. Marvin. This one was a little bit harder, but we were pretty sure we knew what we had. And if you see, there's some lettering on the side of the hull there. By the way, look at the paint. You can see, but you can just make out Heinz Lumber Company. Heinz Lumber Company. You can see some davits in the background with some of the other imagery you were seeing, cabins on the deck. There's something different here that you're going to see that you won't see, hold that for 1 second, on shipwrecks down here, shipwrecks on Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, Erie, Ontario. What are we missing here? Quagga mussels. That's right. We don't have the quagga mussels. We don't have the zebra mussels. So we can very clearly see green paint on the A.A. Parker that is over 100 years old. I mean, it's amazing the condition. Think how cold Lake Superior is. I don't know if any of you have gone swimming in Lake Superior lately. I jump in every morning, at least if we're up at our cabin. I like to do that. There's nothing better to wake you up in the morning. But I'm going to put a pause on. You got a question?
Just all the imaging that you're showing is from your ROV?
That's correct. Yep. Yeah, we're actually without an ROV at the moment because we contracted with the same company that built this one. The company's called Deep Ocean Engineering. Hold that thought 1 second. They built this Phantom S4 for us like 35 years ago. Works great, but it's not supported any longer. So if there's a problem with it, we're kind of done. So we ordered a new one, and all the thrusters that go on the new one, the California wildfires heavily impacted the factory where they build these thrusters. So we've been waiting all summer, and we still don't have any idea how soon we're going to get this thing. So we're sort of without an ROV at this point. Yes, sir. Just little particles, you know, little bits of, I don't know what it is, stuff off the bottom. You get this kind of sediment that'll settle on top of these shipwrecks and things like that. But it does, yeah. So it's got thrusters all over it, and we can kind of hover. And Daryl's really good at keeping from kicking all that stuff up, but in some cases there's no way around it. If you're anywhere near the lake, all that stuff that's settled, let's say since 1914, you know, it's going to kick up a little bit. But yes.
How much documentation do you have that can either limit the square mileage that you have to look at, or like those 3 boats or any of the other ships?
That's a great question. So documentation, the research that we do, we're lucky. We have a team of researchers that are all over, particularly all over Michigan, but there's some in Wisconsin as well. People are so dedicated, these researchers, and Rick Mixter's another good example, or Fred Stonehouse. They will find all of these primary source materials. I've gotten kind of lazy, actually, because I don't really need to do a whole lot of research, because as soon as we find something, if it's in a certain area, we have a pretty good idea. And we do set up a grid. We set up a series of grids, and Daryl Ertel, our director of marine operations, that's his winter job, is to do this research, set up the grids where we're going to tow that sonar. And we call it, it's like you're saying that you're mowing the lawn. Thinking when you're mowing the lawn, you're going back and forth, back and forth. That's what we're doing, towing the sonar. But if we find something in a certain area, a target, there's a couple things we do, and I'll show a couple more images here in a second. But we often have kind of a general idea of what might be within a grid, but that doesn't mean that a wreck that had 10 survivors and they say it sank here, where they said it sank, it could be 30 miles away from where they think it sank. And think about what we all might be doing if our ship is sinking. Exactly. That's right. That's right. Now, the Western Reserve that I'm going to get to in a minute, I promise, but the Western Reserve, that was pretty much where it was meant to be, or where it was said to have gone down. That was kind of unusual, but yeah, is this answering your question?
Well, and the companies that own these ships would have kept logs as to what their trajectory was and where they might be and everything.
Not really. I mean, it depends on how far back we go. The captains back then had a lot of latitude. They weren't like they were today, where they could track. We all have many of us have AIS systems these days, or marine traffic. There's an app you can get called Marine Traffic, and you can see ships all over the world and where they are in real time. That's a new thing. Back in the day, half the time, they weren't even sure what all the crew would have been on a certain ship, and that's created problems and questions as well. Think about people jumping ship, so to speak. You could be the guy who got in trouble in your hometown, and you can get on let's say a guy was in Manistee, and let's just say the police are after him, and he could get on a ship, sail all the way up to Duluth, and jump off of that, get some pay and then get off of that ship. That's kind of a weird example, but it's not the way it is now. Things are so much really more detailed, I think, in a way now. I'm not explaining this very well, but it was a different era, to be sure. And they knew that ship was going to be leaving at a relatively certain time, and it should be arriving somewhere else at a certain time. As we got up closer to the turn of the century, we got to World War II, you had ship tracking stations, like the Straits of Mackinac had. Literally, there was a little house on the shoreline that would monitor ship traffic passing. And then also your lighthouse keepers were responsible for monitoring that ship traffic as well, as much as they could. But it was kind of after the fact kind of thing. So it's not unusual to have shipwrecks, and the CF Curtis that I just mentioned, and the Selden E. Marvin and the Annie Peterson, those three ships just sailed away and nobody ever saw them again. Think about all the wives at home, the kids, the family members. All they knew was that, my brother was a first mate on the Curtis, and they left Lance in that area, Baraga, and nobody ever saw them again. So they didn't really know. They knew where they were supposed to be. And sometimes these ships would sink and disappear without a trace. I mean, no wreckage or anything. They're just gone. So what Fred Stonehouse would say in a lot of his books is that they sailed into a crack in the lake and just vanished. It disappeared. So different era, to be sure. So, all right, the Western Reserve. This is the ship that was a really, really big deal in the summer of 1892. And this ship was well known in its time, and it was a pretty young ship. It was built in 1890 at the Cleveland Shipbuilding Company. The hull, as it was being built, it was steamship number 9. Its sister ship, a ship called the W.H. Gilcher, was steamship number 10. And they were both built at the Cleveland Shipbuilding Company, again, the summer of 1890. These were two of the first. Some sources tell us they were the first all-steel ships operating in the Great Lakes. These ships were built to be record-breaking ships. They were built to be fast. They were built to have the most modern conveniences. It was the kind of ship where the owner of the ship would take a cruise on it, that kind of thing. Any of this sound familiar? That's exactly what the Edmund Fitzgerald was. The Fitzgerald was the flagship of the Columbia Transportation Division, part of the Ogle Bay Norton Company. which doesn't exist anymore. But they were owned, Fitzgerald was owned by the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company. Well, we can make some analogies, comparisons here with the Western Reserve. That was part of the Minch Steamship Company, and a gentleman by the name of Peter G. Minch was the owner. He owned as a company his dad started. He was a captain in his own right. They owned 14 ships in their fleet. This was the newest. The Gilcher, that other ship I mentioned, was going to a different fleet, but this was his newest ship. This was his safest ship. And this is the one that was breaking records. One newspaper from the day, I read this headline myself, the Greyhound of the Inland Seas, it was called, because it was such a fast ship. And there's not many photographs of this thing, and there's a reason for that. This ship was a little over 300 feet long, 318 feet, not huge, not big by today's standards, but back then that was a pretty good sized ship. And again, the fact that it was all steel. Most of your ships operating at that point were wooden. They also had ships that were composite ships, part wood, part steel. And then eventually we started seeing even iron ships, but steel ships like the Western Reserve coming along. When this thing was launched, very much like the Edmund Fitzgerald again, this ship was a big deal when it was launched in Cleveland. Crowds, massive crowds came to watch this newspaper, the media of the day. And you can see here the large crowd witnessed the launch of the steel steamer Western Reserve built for P.G. Minch and others at the yard of the Cleveland Shipbuilding Company yesterday afternoon. The word was given promptly at 3 o'clock. She went in very smoothly, both ends striking the water at the same time. The Western Reserve is the largest vessel ever built at this port. Her dimensions are length over 318 feet, keel 300 feet, beam 41 feet. She's 1 foot wider than the steamer Pontiac, turned out by the same company. The latter vessel has gained a reputation of being one of the largest carriers and fastest vessels on the lake. And the Western Reserve is calculated to carry 300 tons more on the same draft, so on and so forth. This is a big deal when this ship came out. Maritime journals, newspapers, articles about this thing. Again, I don't want to overdo it with the comparisons with the Fitzgerald, but there's some eerie comparisons here, because when the Fitz was launched, there was a crowd of practically 10,000 people came to see that. And one of the Detroit newspapers in 1958 called it the largest man-made object ever dropped into fresh water. And when the Fitzgerald was launched, it was the largest ship on the Great Lakes. This one was not the largest, but it was one of the largest. And there was a lot of buzz about it. It was, as I said, they called the Inland Greyhound by one of the newspapers. It was called the safest boat on the inland seas. And you can see some of the articles that some of these researchers that I mentioned that dug up and found for us. You can see here, Western Reserve breaks the lake grain carrying record. Go on to another one. The largest coal cargo of the season has just been taken into Milwaukee by the steamer Western Reserve, 3,200 tons, so on and so forth. This ship was a big deal. Peter G. Minch, he was about my age. I'm 58 at this point. He was in his late 50s rather, when this ship was built. And he had a big family. His sister married into the Steinbrenner family. This tells you the circles that they were moving in. Think of George Steinbrenner. Think of Henry Steinbrenner. They had their own shipping fleet on the Great Lakes. Most people don't know that. What do we know Steinbrenner for these days? Baseball. How many are Seinfeld fans here too? Remember how Steinbrenner would always be on that? You know, we think about these things, but this is the level of wealth that we're talking about with the Minch family. So it was a pretty big deal. And Peter G. Minch, he owned 14 ships himself. And you think about it, you know, this has not been a particularly hot summer, but this is down in Cleveland where the headquarters of the Minch fleet was, where his headquarters was. Peter G. Minch was a captain on the Great Lakes of ships. He kind of worked his way up to becoming a captain. But like anybody else, I think most people think the idea of a summer cruise sounds pretty good, right? How many have ever been on a cruise on the Great Lakes? Well, how about a cruise period? Let's say that, because the Great Lakes, not like it used to be. Think of Viking ships and things like that. You'll see the Viking ships traveling the Great Lakes now. You know, back in the day, taking a cruise in the Great Lakes, it wasn't as big of a deal like you see today. I mean, those Viking cruises, they're not inexpensive, we'll put it that way. But back in the day, there were so many ships and so many passenger ships that were operating, coming into places like Petoskey and Harbor Springs and going up to Mackinac Island and things like that. Well, Peter G. Minch had the idea. It's summer, it's getting to late summer, it's August, it's 1892. He wanted to kind of get away from his work a little bit. This is a quote from a newspaper after the fact, after the ship sank. But it reads, the millionaire owner had long thought of a trip on the lakes as a means of escaping from the business cares for a few days. He would take his wife, youngest children with him, an old sailor himself. Naturally, he thought of what might happen, and so, of his fleet of 14 vessels, he chose the one he considered to be the staunchest. The opinion was that his opinion was that of every vessel owner on the lakes. The Western Reserve was the safest boat on the inland seas. As guests, he invited his wife's sister, Mary Ingleby, and her daughter, Bertha. That is one of their photographs on the right of the Western Reserve. You can see right there. This, again, was a young ship at this point. And it was Cleveland. It was summer of 1892. I did a little research. It's amazing the records you can dig into. And I found weather records from 1892 in Cleveland. They had a lot of days that were in the 90s. A lot of days in the 90s. I would get hot wearing shorts and having a t-shirt on if it's in the 90s. Think of how people were dressing back then. Air conditioning wouldn't come along for about another decade. So the idea of taking a cruise probably sounded pretty good and going up north. Think about how people do it all the time, and they go to places like Mackinac Island. The Grand Hotel, built in 1887. The idea was between the railroads and the steamships, you could have people coming up from places like Detroit, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Chicago, wherever, where you really couldn't escape that heat. And think again how people were dressed. Go up to places like Grand Hotel or the Lakeview or any number of other hotels, the Island House, whatever, on Mackinac Island. And those cool breezes by comparison, compared to the cities down in the lower parts of the lakes, it was a big difference. So you can imagine that Peter Minch probably thought, yeah, I want to get away a little bit. I'm going to take the family. We're going to take our newest ship. And again, he was a captain, so he knew the dangers that could be out there. But this is August we're talking about. This is August, presumably one of the safest times of the year to travel on the lakes. So the stage was being set. This is artwork of the Western Reserve. It's down at the National Museum of the Great Lakes down in Toledo, Ohio. And when they found out that we had discovered the shipwreck, they started sharing all kinds of things that they had in their collections with us, at least images. So the stage was getting set at this point. And August 28th, 1892, August 28th, 1892, they were set to depart from Cleveland. So you've got the regular crew on board this ship. In all total, I think it was going to be right around 28 people that would be on the ship. But a number of the people on board the ship were Peter Minch's family. He had his young daughter. He had his young son. His daughter was Florence. His son, Philip Minch, couldn't make it. He had to stay behind. Turned out not to be a bad thing, but he probably had to keep working. But his wife, Anna, his wife's sister and her young daughter was on board, and they were on board. They were going to take this fun summer cruise, and they departed out of the Cleveland area. They had to pass up through Detroit. So it was August 28th, 1892. That ship pulls out of Cleveland and they start heading north. They're eventually headed to Two Harbors, Minnesota, headed over to this end of the lake, right over in here. So they've got a pretty long trip ahead of them. Made their way without incident, beautiful conditions up through Lake Huron, through the St. Mary's River, up into getting closer to Sault Ste. Marie, and then eventually going through the Sioux Locks, period, in order to get up into the Lake Superior level. So they had lovely, lovely weather on the way up. And they passed through the locks. This is a picture in 1896. So 4 years after the Western Reserve passed through the locks, heading upbound. By the way, a couple of cool things about this picture. For one, look how people are dressed, right? Gosh, people really dressed up back then compared to the way we do today. That bridge, you can see that rail bridge is actually still there. It still crosses next to the International Bridge there. But they would have passed upbound. They would have eventually gotten up into Whitefish Bay, but people were watching them, this brand new ship cruising through. And again, after the fact, the Cleveland Plain Dealer had an article that said about them, never was a jollier party on board a steamer than the Western Reserve when she passed through the canal Tuesday night. Captain Minch and his 2 children stood upon the bridge. All were in the best of spirits. So everybody was having so much fun on board this ship as it was headed upbound. Upbound, they got up into Whitefish Bay over here within sight of the Whitefish Point lighthouse, and things started to change a little bit. Again, it's August, but the weather started getting kind of rough, enough that it was kicking up enough waves in the bay that the captain of the ship, a man by the name of Albert Myers, conferred with Captain Minch. We're going to drop anchor for a little bit. and just wait this weather out. Because again, they've got a pretty precious cargo on board. This ship was traveling light at that point. There was no cargo. They were headed up to two harbors to get iron ore. And but there was nothing, they weren't carrying anything. So it was traveling in ballast, very light at that point. They decide to drop anchor in Whitefish Bay. They wait for a couple of hours and they decide, this isn't getting any worse. Let's just go. They heaved anchor, brought the anchor up out of Whitefish Bay, around the Whitefish Point lighthouse, headed up into Lake Superior, and they get about 60 miles up into the lake. By the way, that line right there separates Canadian waters. There's US waters right there. And eventually they were headed here to two harbors. That was their goal. And they got about 60 miles northwest of Whitefish Point, 60 miles northwest. At about 9 p.m., this is what started to happen. This brand new ship literally started to break in half. And a gale was blowing at this point. Now, as they were cruising, smashing into those waves, as they were headed their way up, headed towards two harbors, it had to be a pretty rough ride. We can imagine it was a rough ride. Imagine, Captain Mitch's wife, the kids on board, you've got her sister, her daughter. They all were probably getting knocked around a little bit. Pretty rough. This thing had no cargo, so the ship was riding very high in the water. It was taking a little bit more of a beating, to the point where that storm was getting a little worse, not out of control, not a terrible storm, but just enough that this ship, 60 miles northwest of Whitefish Point, literally started to break in half. They heard this terrible crash, and then the ship started acting really strangely at that point. And I think everybody knew, especially Captain Myers and Captain Minch, we are in trouble. We are in trouble. We've got to get those families, we got to get the kids out, we've got to get the crew, got to get everybody into these lifeboats, get away from this ship, because this ship is breaking up and sinking. There was a wheelsman that was up in the pilot house here, a guy by the name of Harry W. Stewart. Harry Stewart was one of the last to leave the pilot house. As a matter of fact, this is artwork, by the way, by the artist Bob McGreevy, Robert McGreevy. Are any of you familiar with him? No, he's been doing maritime artwork for decades, but he's illustrated, because nobody was out there taking pictures of these things, but he's been able to illustrate based on some of the accounts of what was happening. Harry Stewart literally had to jump a gap of about 3 feet that was getting wider as he jumped it, as that ship, the bow section and the stern section were severing. They're breaking apart from each other. That man probably should have died at that moment. He had to jump that section to get to the lifeboats right here. There were 2 lifeboats. Number 1 lifeboat was an all steel lifeboat. Number 2 lifeboat was an all wooden lifeboat. Most of the family members and Captain Minch and some of the other crew got into the wooden lifeboat, and the rest of the crew got into the number 1 steel lifeboat. Now, they were able to launch these things, these lifeboats, and strangely enough, the engine was still going full speed ahead as they were launching. And that comes out later too. We're not exactly sure why that was. Maybe as the ship was breaking apart, something was severed. We're not really sure, but either that or the engineer and everybody, the crew that was down in the engine room, felt we're going to die if we don't get out of here fast enough. But for whatever reason, that ship, the prop was still turning. It was still full steam ahead at that point. So steel lifeboat is lowered, wooden lifeboat is launched, or both of them are lowered about the same time. Wooden lifeboat with the family members on board, like I said, the rest of the crew. Steel lifeboat, most of the crew. Steel lifeboat, as soon as it's in the water, turns over. They were thinking it was damaged, and the rest of that crew is in the water. Only 2 of the crew that was in the steel lifeboat was recovered by the wooden lifeboat. So think of the shock right now of people. It was probably very surreal. People probably can't imagine what was happening at this point, or at least couldn't, their mind probably had trouble believing all this was happening at that moment. The rest of that crew is gone except for 2 of them. Harry W. Stewart, the guy I just mentioned who jumped that crack, he happened to be one of the 2 that ended up being recovered into the wooden lifeboat. Him and Captain Myers' son, who was another wheelsman. So two were recovered, pulled into the wooden lifeboat. That wooden lifeboat was overloaded at this point. They're out there. It's still light. It gets dark pretty late up there. Still light out. But it got dark pretty quickly. And now you've got a gale blowing. You've got this wooden lifeboat that's overloaded. You've got waves coming into that lifeboat. They were doing everything they could do to try to get that water out of that lifeboat, using their hats, using anything they could do to try to get that water out of there. It's getting dark. They're 60 miles northwest of Whitefish Point, about 35 miles or so north of that shoreline that we call the Shipwreck Coast. And now it's getting dark. And they're in the middle of a storm, middle of a gale. They were out there. Imagine what's going through their minds at this point. The ship, this brand new, beautiful ship that they were just on, having this lovely, just a few hours before summer cruise, is now turned into this nightmare that they're in the middle of. And a good part of the crew is dead at this point, that they drowned out there in the lake. Now, they do the only thing they can do at this point. They start pulling on the oars and they start pulling for the shoreline. They're out there in the middle of the lake. They see lights coming and they can see another ship coming really close to them. It's a ship called the Nishodo. That's literally the Nishodo. I found artwork on it right there. So I tried to roll it in there. But imagine they're out there, it's dark, they have no flares, they've got nothing that they can signal that ship with. And they actually at one point tried to light one of the women's shawls on fire so they could have something that could get the attention of that crew on board the Nishodo. But everything was so wet that they couldn't light the shawl of that lady. So the Nishodo disappears into the distance, like something out of a movie almost at this point. And they're still pulling on those oars. They're still bailing. They're out there for 10 hours at this point. So overnight, and they start getting close to the shoreline. They get within 1 mile of the shoreline, and they're in the general vicinity of the Deer Park Life Saving Station. So the sun has come up at this point. It's getting light. They've been 10 hours. They've survived the night. Their lifeboat has not been overtaken by the waves. And they probably, some of them are probably starting to think, you know what, maybe we're going to make it here. But I think some of them that knew, probably the crew knew that the most dangerous thing was ahead of them at this point, and that was getting that lifeboat safely to shore. They got within 1 mile of the shoreline and that lifeboat turned over. Think how those waves come crashing in and everything else. Lifeboat turned over, and that was it, really. There ended up being one survivor. That guy, Harry Stewart, who jumped that crack, who was one of the 2 that got pulled out of that steel lifeboat, he ended up putting, and one account indicates that he was able to put on a life jacket when he was in the water. When he surfaced, there was a life jacket near him. He was able to put that armor, and he ended up being the only survivor. So the kids, the parents, everybody was gone. They had all survived that whole time just to get within 1 mile of salvation, and they didn't make it. Deer Park Life Saving Station was about 4 miles away. This is one of these very remote stations. And there's another thing that Harry W. Stewart lucked out, if you could call it that. He should have died when he jumped that crack, probably. He should have drowned when his lifeboat went under, and he probably should have drowned again when that wooden lifeboat turned over 1 mile from the shoreline. The only other thing that was working in his favor that night was the fact that it was August. If this had been December, if this had been November, had been a cold, wintry, walking about 4 miles to get to that Deer Park station to report what had happened. And he did get to the station, but yeah, imagine trying to bring your lifeboat in through conditions like that. And if any of you have been up there on that shoreline or any of these Great Lakes shorelines when a storm is blowing, to bring a boat in safely, pretty difficult task for sure. So some of the documents that we have, primary source documents that can corroborate what was happening. This is actually from the Deer Park Fram, J.H. Fram. He wrote, at 2:30 p.m., wheelsman Harry W. Stewart of the steamer Western Reserve arrived at station with the following information. That steamer broke in two, 60 miles west of Whitefish Point, 25 miles offshore at 9 p.m., August 30th. Crew took to their yawl boat, total member 27. The owner and wife and 3 children and a lady inclusive. Boat capsized at 7:30 a.m., about 1 mile offshore. As far as was known, was the only man saved. So Stewart reported he thinks he's the only man saved. I ordered the crew, now this is Fram talking about his crew. I ordered the crew at once to follow up the beach to Grand Marais. I gave him stimulants and dry clothing provided for his life belts, oars, boat number 2, that's the wooden lifeboat, within 5 miles of Grand Marais, but no bodies arrived at Grand Marais at 11 p.m., so on and so forth. So we can see this in those original logs. Rick Mixter actually had these. He loaned these to us. So there's the guy right there. That's Harry W. Stewart. He's the only reason we know what we know about the final moments of that shipwreck. All these shipwrecks have all these interesting sub-stories, and some of them are even going on today, believe it or not, from an 1892 shipwreck. We put the press release out after we found the shipwreck. And before we knew it, we had descendants of the Minch family reaching out to us, but we also had descendants of Harry W. Stewart reaching out to us. And actually, his grandson is still alive. Harry W. Stewart's grandson is still alive. So we connected with them. We're actually going to go out and meet with them again. We're going to create a documentary telling the story of the Western Reserve. But this particular picture, that family had never seen before. So we were able to share a picture with them of their ancestor. And the only reason they're around is because he survived that shipwreck. And then they shared some pictures of him that we had never seen before when he was even younger, and then when he was older, in his older years, because he actually stayed with the Minch fleet, believe it or not, and became a captain of his own ship. And so he captained 2 different ships in his latter years, in his later years. But Stewart's the reason we know what we know. Now, we're going to skip ahead. 132 years later, July 2024, we're going out of Grand Marais in the David Boyd, and we're going to document this shipwreck. There's Daryl on the right, Dan Ertel on the left. And now, a couple things. We wanted to get some closer sonar images, and I mentioned earlier that I was going to show you a little bit what that looks like when we tow sonar. Daryl and Dan have this down, and particularly Daryl, because they can see something that looks like this on the bottom of the lake. Doesn't really look like anything, does it? That's what you might see in the sonar. But Daryl had a feeling, an inkling that it was something. Now, I'm going to show you what happens. Now, Daryl and Dan are actually talking in this little video here because there's a lot of excitement. But here's Daryl. He's going to tell you what happens as we're approaching. Because what ends up happening, we have to adjust the sonar if we want to get a closer look at it. This is actually when they found it. This is not the documentation part. We don't have the audio.
Well, it's
don't know how
July
we can link this
22nd,
in. I don't know what we can do to try to get the audio going on this.
We
Let
haven't
me
found anything
check
yet
something
this
on
summer.
my laptop
We
here
got
because this is
2
a
or
few
3
minutes,
targets on
but
this
I can.
last pass. We're going by the first one that looks the best.
No, I don't think we're going to have the audio, unfortunately, with this. But I'll explain to you what Daryl's doing
Just
here.
over 500
That
feet of
screen
water.
right there is
The
what
boat
he's
should be
watching the
going
whole
over
time that
the
we're towing
target
sonar
in
here. What happens is we have to
500
switch the
feet.
frequency. We would go from 150 kilohertz to 900
So we'll know
kilohertz.
if
That's
it's
going to
something
bring in
when
a
the boat
much,
goes
much
over.
closer view. And that tow fish that I pointed out looks like a torpedo. They allow that to get very close to the bottom of the lake and close to that shipwreck. But what it does is it ends up giving us a very, very close view. Because you can't hear him, I'm going to skip ahead here and show you what it looks like on the sonar. And so what you're seeing here is literally the whole bow section of that ship resting on top of the stern section of that ship. We have never seen a shipwreck quite like this, but when it broke up, literally that stern section went down first, and right on top of it was the bow section. So it's a very, very unusual shipwreck to look at. And that's when we switch up to that closer view, that frequency that allows us to get a closer view, that's what it's looking like on the bottom of the lake. Now, Daryl likes to harass a lot of us. Yes?
And you knew that was exactly the ship you were looking for?
Not yet. Not yet. So we had an inkling that this was the Western Reserve, but there was another ship that sank in the same area as a result of a collision. But we don't think a collision would have looked exactly like this. We found a number of other ships that were results of collision, and very often, not always, but very often they're in one piece, one hole, but there's like this gouge in the side of it kind of thing. That image right there, Daryl was sure himself that it was the Western Reserve at that point, but we needed to prove it. We needed to prove it. So Daryl likes to say, nobody wants to come out and help when we're searching for shipwrecks. But when it's time we find one, then he makes fun of us because we all come out of the woodwork to help. But at the same time, we have to, because in order to launch that ROV, we need a big crew. We need people to tend the ROV. It's got a tether attached to it with microfibers in it that bring an image of what's on the bottom of the lake. We have people that are tending the outside, and then there's a few of us will be inside the cabin watching what's going on. So there's the ROV. It's launched. Daryl's piloting. It goes down, and this is what we saw as we got down to that shipwreck. One of the very first things we saw, one of the first, was the bell on the forward mast of this ship. We saw that bell very, very clearly. So he was able to maneuver that ROV to get in a little closer. That bell is in such good condition, but if you look at that mast, it looks like a matchstick, the way it was just snapped right there. The very first thing we saw was something that we were hoping we would see. And it turned out to be, and I'll show it to you in a second, but the only artifact remaining from this shipwreck is actually down at the National Museum of the Great Lakes. It's the starboard side running light. And I have a friend by the name of Bob Campbell. Bob is a shipwreck researcher. He's a photographer. Probably the most famous shipwreck picture on the lakes is of the Fitzgerald. He took it. But he harassed us. He's like, are you guys looking for this thing? Have you found it yet? He will call me every year to ask if we'd found it yet. I'm like, Bob, we're looking, all right? Give us a break here. This is part of the boiler house too, or part, you can see a door hanging open, but part of the boiler house, and it's hard to tell from this imagery, but this, we were knowing at this point, without seeing a name, we were looking at the Western Reserve. We were looking at this all steel ship that was exactly where it was reported to have gone down by Harry W. Stewart. But you can even see some of the white trim that's on top of that boiler house right there. There, you can see the white trim along the top of it, portholes, that steel side right there. But we started to get really excited right there. We saw this running light. We're thinking, holy cow, this is the thing Bob keeps sending us pictures of, but he is sending pictures of the starboard light. This, and we are on the port side, is going to be the port running light. So Daryl was able, and again, look at that paint. You can see all the way from 1892. Daryl was able to maneuver that ROV in just close enough. You start to see the lens is a red color, but this is a very unique style of running light. And again, as we were getting closer, we were really able to tell this is exactly the shipwreck that we're looking at, because it's absolutely identical to the starboard side running light. Look at the red, and there's scroll work on the starboard light that goes over the top of the lens and over the top of the housing. And here Daryl's trying to maneuver without bashing into it. But we were able to maneuver close enough, and we could see eventually, and he's adjusting the lighting at this point. We were able to see eventually, you're going to start to see that same scroll work right there. And can you see the letters? Port. It is that same running light. It's just the other side. And now we know we've got this steel ship, same trim, same paint, same design, same running light. We had found the Western Reserve at this point. Now, I'm going to go back for a second here. One thing that we don't think about, when we're inside the cabin of that research boat and we find a shipwreck, there is a huge amount of excitement. You couldn't hear the audio that went along with this, with all of us just going berserk inside, especially when we saw that running light, because we'd all seen this image 100 times. We see it under glass down in Toledo, starboard light down at the National Museum of the Great Lakes. But I also thought Bob could finally quit harassing me now, because we found that shipwreck he wanted us to find for so many years. But the thing you have to reflect on for the moment, we're all so happy and excited at this point. But what we have to step back and think about is the fact that there were 28 people on board this ship, and there were only 27, or there were only one survivor. 27 of them went down with this ship. There were multiple family connections on this ship, let alone all the Minch kids, right? Charlie was 9, Florence was 6, Bertha was 10. That was the sister-in-law of Anna Minch, or sister-in-law of Captain Minch, and Anna's sister. So you had the whole family on board there. Then you had Captain Albert Myers. His wheelsman's son, age 19, was on board as well. So we had a lot of families connected on this. And plus, these are all people that had loved ones at home, right? So you've got to think about what this really reflects here, the seriousness. We never see remains of any kind near any of these shipwrecks. We don't see them. Never seen anything. You see a lot of artifacts down there, a lot of objects that reflect daily life on that ship. We'll see cups and saucers and coffee, big steel coffee pots and chairs and bunks and toilets, believe it or not. We've seen all kinds of interesting things, but we've never seen any remains. And I think partly because if you think in this case, the crew was on board that steel lifeboat, it overturned, who knows where they all went. But you know that, think of the line out of Gordon Lightfoot's song, right? Does anybody remember that? We reflects on the fact that Superior never gives up her dead. God, I can't even think of the line now. I've heard that song a million times, but he does make a reference to that, and there's something to it. A lot of times when these ships go down, nobody finds anything. But Harry W. Stewart, the survivor, there's Captain Inch right there, Captain Albert Myers, and then the engineer. These are all famous guys. They are long time officers on ships. They knew what they were doing, but they obviously, their luck ran out that night. The starboard light that I mentioned right there, it had a bit of a storied history as well. I mentioned to you a little while ago that there was a survivor from the Minch family, Philip Minch, the son of Peter Minch, was not able to join them on this trip. Probably the best thing that ever happened to it. I mean, sad because he lost his family, right? But he did survive. He went on to be a captain himself at the same time. But that starboard light was given to him in later years. He hung that from his front porch, and he called his house the Starboard Light. And every night he would turn that light on the porch, memory of his lost family members. And that ended up being in a couple of other museums, and now it's at the National Museum of the Great Lakes. Okay, I'll speed it up. Last couple slides here. But there's, you can see it's under glass right there at the National Museum of the Great Lakes. You can see that same scroll work. They're going to loan us that. So we're going to have it eventually on exhibit up there at the museum. Last couple slides here. There you can see that same scroll work again. And there's Bob Campbell. I had to have a picture of Bob in there, who kept harassing me. Bob's a great guy. He loves cats. But that's him with the starboard light. And I'm going to just skip through these, just some other parts of the story here and what ended up following. They did end up finding many of the bodies afterwards, not all of them, strewn along that shoreline. There's a bit of a ghost story that goes along with this, and it's featured in Fred Stonehouse's Haunted Lakes book. Long story on the ghost was there was one of the crewmen on the life-saving station and kept pointing out at the lake, and then this apparition just disappeared. The next day, when they were searching for bodies, he found that exact person on the beach. Nightmare. This guy ended up becoming a fabled, legendary life-saving service and later Coast Guard guy. Why would he make up a story like this? Very, very strange. I mentioned the sister ship of the Western Reserve. 2 months later, it vanished on Lake Michigan, just disappeared. So you have these two ships of the same design, same production, same steel. One breaks in two, the other one's gone. It just disappears. Good question. So last couple slides here. Yep, the gill troop vanishes. So what happened? Good question. What ended up coming out later was the research told them that the steel that they used in the production was later came to be known as soft steel. And then in latter years, they might have called it brittle steel, where it couldn't handle that twisting and turning and pounding. And ships like the Daniel J. Morrell, brittle steel, it eventually cracked, although that ship was 60 years old, Daniel J. Morrell. The Gilcher and the Western Reserve weren't even 2 years old at that point. So that's the belief. And there were a number of headlines where weakened construction, defective structural weaknesses, so on and so forth. Positive she broke a two, survivor of the Western Reserve. They were thinking that it was unduly punished with their owner. They thought they were trying to show off for the owner. There was a lot of speculation that was coming out. And that's another analogy with the Fitzgerald, because the speculation still is ongoing with the Fitzgerald. And I think this is the last one. From the Duluth Evening Herald, 1892, the weather at the same time of the disaster was not that stormy. The steamer Spokane, now Ness Army Harbor, passed Whitefish Point. At the time, the Western Reserve went down, and her officers agree in statement that the sea was only a little bit rough. The accident teaches a lesson that should be a lasting one to the maritime world, that strength is fully as desirable as space, speed, or cheapness. This kind of ended up becoming a theme at that point. And Western Reserve area, that's the area down there along Lake Erie. That's what it was named after. And special thanks to Fred Stonehouse, Dan Fountain, Mike Spears, Rick Mixter, Bob Campbell, and Robert McGreevy. They're the researchers that helped us on this. It's a tragic story. It's one that's all but forgotten these days, but it was every bit as big as what the Fitzgerald was and is now. It just didn't have that whole folk singer, Canadian folk singer thing coming in. But it is a shipwreck that's still talked about a lot with shipwreck researchers at this point. So that's it. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming to the program. And